So how you feeling, Edwin?
Feeling good, man. How are you?
I'm pretty good. It's good to be back here in Columbus, where we first met and began our journey together as Black men, and have continued in some ways, this ongoing conversation about our lives and our becoming. And in that spirit, I really want to just take some time to think about what transformation has meant for us and what that's looked like. So specifically, what does transformation look like for Black men, and what are the kinds of common narratives about who we're supposed to be that we've often been taught?
Yeah, I think that we are often placed as young men in a context of capitalism and patriarchy. And so from an early age, a lot of our focus on who it is that we can become is really focused on, provision, being able to provide safety. I think about even my earliest schooling days, doing well in my classes and being a good student was connected to an idea of how I would be able to be successful, and particularly in a context of how I could provide provision for a family one day. And that was something that was explicitly stated to me as a very young man. So I think that entire structure is really heavily related to how we are taught to grow or who we are taught to become. And I don't think it just happens in this kind of school context either. I think even from earlier days, the idea of falling down and skinning your knee and someone pushing you away from crying by saying, you're a big boy or you're a man, right? And trying to move you away from your emotions and what you feel, what you're actually feeling in your body, your pain. These ideas of toughness are structured around how we can protect ourselves from ways that the world will treat us, and what will happen to us as we live life. Even the ideas of being smart is in many ways is structured around thinking about how we can protect ourselves from folks who might take advantage of us or do harm to us, and how we can also position ourselves to take advantage of situations and opportunities that are presented before us. And even just this idea of connecting masculinity to leadership is really based in this idea of being able to take the reins and move ahead. And so all of these kind of forms of becoming or transformation in this context really focus, I think, on the external. And what becomes obvious to me is that it has very little to do with who we are and what we actually want. Those are not the predominant questions, I think, that we're asked as we're growing into this. And so the types of transformation that we are called to often are cookie cutter. They're set for everyone. And the individuality or the special parts of who we are lost in that. How about for you?
When I think about transformation as a man, the first sort of idea or example I come to is my grandfather. So I grew up with my grandparents, and my grandfather was also a pastor. And so many of the ways that I saw masculinity modeled were in the context of marriage, and theirs was in many respects a very traditional marriage. But I also saw it in the context of this pastor, this leader of a community, a person who was continually before people, having to speak and to represent, a person who was depended on to meet a variety of needs in that context. But one of the things that stands out for me is that as much as my grandfather was, in many respects, a man's man, right? Familiar with physical labor, not afraid to get his hands dirty, willing to do what needed doing. I remember when I would listen to him preach, he was always a very passionate speaker, very charismatic, very much full of conviction in his speaking. But I also think about, as a child, watching him become so passionately moved by what he was saying, they would often be in tears. And it signaled something for me about the fact that this man was also a person who was feeling, a person in touch with his feelings and emotions and not afraid to express them. And it occurs to me that so much of what you said, particularly about this idea that manhood and masculinity is about performance, I think of the joke from a while back by the comedian Chris Rock about how men are the only people who are not loved unconditionally. This idea that a man being loved is about what he does, what he produces, how he performs. And it occurs to me that so much of our challenge arises out of this pressure to perform, the pressure to look to be a certain way, and how often we become our best police around how we ought to be. So folk are gonna clown you, if you're wearing a certain something. I mean, I even imagine me as a kid might have looked at me now and thought, like, what is this guy wearing, right? Like, but as a grown man, I'm like, hey, I like soft colors. I like luxurious fabrics.
It's fall.
It feels good. It's fall. It's sweater weather, right?
Yeah.
So at this point, right, like so much of that transformation is also grounded in becoming very deeply comfortable with who you are and what you value.
For sure, yeah. And I think even as we are moved towards the roles that we might play, so I think about how so much of that instruction around masculinity is around like this father-husband model.
For sure.
And how that even shaped how I thought of myself in contexts as early as high school. And how I related to people, how I related to friends, potential partners, was all really part of checking off boxes and not really seeing them and seeing the relationship, seeing them fully human, but seeing them as something that is part of me attaining manhood. And as I grew, I recognized the lack of humanity in that, the lack of love present in that. And you start to recognize that some of these conceptions are failing us. So I want to move us to a place as I think about kind of the systems that we operate within that can shape our ideas of who we can become and how we get to a place of, achieving some level of security or significance and success. And how a lot of times when we think about success, it's connected to this idea of being exceptional. I think for both of us, as we've talked on our podcast, Black Men Unlearning, we've recognized that graduate school was a space where this kind of socialization was taking place for us. And it's not the only form of this, but it's common for us. So what's been your process for moving toward growth without it becoming isolating or doing it in a way that's positively self-serving?
So I think one of the big things for me was learning how to separate what I do or what I produce from who I am.
Yeah.
On a fundamental level, I had to accept and believe that I'm worthy, I'm loved, I'm valued, I'm cared for, apart from the things I do or produce. And so that internal work for me was critical and essential. And it was then important to translate that internal work into my engagements, my relationships in community. So thinking about, these various spaces where, and even as kids, right, I think about how we are often rewarded for the things we do.
Yeah.
You got good grades, you were well behaved. We learn that performance is value. And so we internalize that even as adults, and yet as adults, we find ourselves often performing in very questionable or problematic ways that often tear us down from the inside, because it's not about intrinsic value or who we fundamentally are, but it's about a desire to be seen, to be viewed in a certain light. And in accepting that I was valued already, one of the things that was important was to recognize that, okay, you don't have to work for more value. And you need to resist the temptation to do things that reward a kind of superficial value.
Yeah.
So wanting to look a certain way, wanting people to see you in a light that's more about their evaluation than your actual understanding and belief in who you are.
I think it's a really important point for you to highlight how people see you, but I also want to think about how we see ourselves. And in that graduate school space, I will tell you, I entered into a PhD program in engineering, and at 23 years old at the time, there was a set of thoughts that I had about what that meant for me and for the prospects of who I could be. And I think as an ode to unlearning, that's not how I think anymore. But when I was entering grad school, I definitely thought of myself as exceptional. And I thought about, my role as a potential partner and like who would want to be with me because of, hey, I'm getting a PhD in engineering. I'm special. I'm set apart. And what that ended up creating was something, or just a way of being, a way of thinking, a way of seeing other people that did not place value on who they were. And it took some significant introspection and some reflection from conversations that I was having with folks I shared community with to recognize how little love was present in that, and to see for myself that this way of being was not serving me well. Something that you say often that I've adopted myself because I think it's really important, it's really poignant, is that we can be folding chair philosophers. So we can recognize that a way of thinking is not good for us and it doesn't do good things for us. And we can fold up our chair and move. We don't have to stay stuck there. And that kind of way of being has helped quite a bit for me in recognizing that once you identify that you're wrong about something, you don't have to keep being wrong. You don't have to double down or dig your heels in. You can adjust and you can recognize that, there are other ways to see the world, to see how you operate, and we can move through that positively.
Yeah, it occurs to me that in a world very much dominated by social media, by content production, by, I don't know, podcasts such as the one that like we create and produce, there is so much messaging around these kinds of superficial and lacking archetypes of what it is to be a man, what it is to transform and grow. I think about the kinds of terms and ideas that get thrown around. One of my ironic favorites, and favorite in the sense that it's hilarious and ridiculous, is that term high value man, right? And what does it mean to be a high value man? And it's often this assigning of very superficial characteristics, often attached to capitalist ideals.
Yes.
Are you getting to the bag? Are you getting money, right? Are you presenting a social image that people value and think is important? So, if you're not 6 feet tall, if you don't have a six pack, if you're not making that six figures, right? It's these very like superficial things that have nothing at all to do with your integrity or character, but everything to do with the things that provoke some vague idea of desire or value.
Yeah.
That's really fleeting and not lasting, right? And not grounded in the kind of person that you actually are versus the performance that people celebrate. And I think of something that a mentor of mine would say often, that what gets celebrated gets repeated.
Yes.
And so part of the challenge is that so many of the tropes and stereotypes and patterns that we see being projected about masculinity broadly and Black masculinity and manhood specifically have a lot to do with what people celebrate.
Yeah.
And we got to ask, why do those things get celebrated? Why do we internalize those as that's the way to be, that's the way to perform? Because I will tell you this, I learn a lot more from people's action and response than I do from their words. So there are things we know publicly or in certain social circles, I shouldn't say I like that, or I shouldn't say I'm into this, or I prefer that. But if we get real honest, and I think at the level of interpersonal relationship, and if we can just be honest, at the level of sexual and romantic relationship, we often see reflected the unhealthy desires and concerns for the right kind of performance, the right kind of image, and then find ourselves devastated by the failure of those images to live up to the thing we actually need or want.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's necessary for us, I think, to sit with the things that are said and not necessarily internalize them. So I know that all men are not trash. I understand that. But I also see the rhetorical value of a statement that's provocative and draws your attention to thinking about why someone might say that. And I think this is a lesson that's important for all of us, is to operate in curiosity, not just in judgment in a way that makes us want to shut down what someone might say to us if it doesn't immediately hit us in a way that we agree with it. So can I be curious as to why someone might say something like that? And I think in that, we recognize that there are some things that we're not doing well. I also think that if you would shut down in a situation where someone draws your attention and not then do the work, it's not because the work is not worthy to be done. It's because you don't desire to do it. And so it's necessary for us to move away from our egos in a way that when we are critiqued, even in ways that don't feel like they're entirely fair, that we're able to see the value in the critique and discern what is something that we need to take on and what's something that we just need to let go.
In the interest of what we need to take on and let go, I think of this phrase that gets tossed around, generational wealth. And too often people think of that in terms of money, but I think there is a generational wealth to be offered in terms of the template and example we offer for what it is to grow and to change, what it is to course correct, and what it is to do these things honestly so that we're not leaving things to chance, right? We're not just leaving stuff out there. We're not forcing every generation to have to start over from scratch and building their emotional and spiritual and mental resources. And so in that vein, you know, my hope is that others would be able to see through the way we're trying to model an open and honest conversation, what it is to say, hey, there are things we need to unlearn. There are things we need to change, but also it is possible to unlearn. It is possible to change, and it's possible to grow.
We got to do the internal work. We should not be doing the internal work in isolation. But by engaging in it, we give ourselves an opportunity to change for ourselves, but also release others from the pressure of being perfect and having to do it one way.
Indeed. That's how we get free.
Yes, sir. Brother, it was great doing this with you.
Likewise, man.
Love you, man.
Love you too.